Okay, we'll start the music. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, December 8th. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today is the third in a series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. It is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Once again, I am delighted to be with all of you and part of this webinar, which we believe will be very interesting. As Bob said, it is predicated on topic 8 of the long document Revelation Revealed. For those of you who are watching, I strongly recommend that you have available to yourself the text of Revelation Revealed. And if you do not have it already, you can download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word, no space, no hyphen, no dot in the middle. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. We will be starting in the middle of page 91 of that document. Now, as an additional item of information, there is no provision on YouTube for you to interject questions or put them forward in ways that we, the participants, we, the panelists, can hear. Therefore, if you wish to ask a question, you should write it down and send us an email message using the email address that is at the bottom of the web page for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. We reserve the right to edit questions. We will use them at some point along the way in combination with perhaps a series of other questions that people have also asked. In any case, I would now like to start the discussion. And as I indicated, we are near the bottom of page 91 of Revelation Revealed, specifically at the heading that reads, parenthesis B, close parenthesis, sacrifice and atonement. Steve, would you please read that short paragraph that immediately follows the heading and also the short quotation immediately beneath it, after which we will stop and talk about it a little bit.
Okay. Sacrifice and atonement. The Apostle Paul appears to have invented the Christian doctrines of the atonement, the teaching that Jesus was the sacrificed son who would satisfy the Father's stern justice and appease the divine wrath, from the Midway Commission 1670.4. In the sentences that complete the same paragraph, the Midway Commission comments as follows. These teachings originated in a praiseworthy effort to make the gospel of the kingdom more acceptable to disbelieving Jews. Though these efforts failed as far as winning the Jews was concerned, they did not fail to confuse and alienate many honest souls in all subsequent generations.
Thank you, Steve. Let's take these two sentences of the quotation separately. Make the gospel of the kingdom more acceptable to disbelieving Jews. Why was that an objective, or why was that a goal, or why was that something that the Apostle Paul wished to achieve? Marvin, could you give your opinion on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the early movement of Christianity arose within the context of Judaism, by and large, and Paul himself was a devout Jew, and so I mean, the initial outreach effort was in that community. So it was kind of natural that they wanted to win over people within that community, and the sacrificial concept was pretty central and sacrificial practice was pretty central in Jewish practice back in that day, and actually in many of the religious cultures of that day as well, all surrounding. Sacrifice was still a real big phenomenon in the organized religious endeavors. So, Paul thought, hey, that would probably bring more people in. But, I think the sacrifice there, in terms of the larger picture, when you make sacrifice a central part of your theology, you're saying something about the nature of God, that God requires penance and sacrifice in order to accept us, his creation, his children, into legitimate fellowship, legitimate relationship, which is, the book calls it a blasphemy on the nature of God, that God's love is unconditional in the context of the Urantia book. There's no condition placed upon it and no sacrifice necessary for us to have intimate relationship with God. So, this is a very interesting passage. The image is that Paul he accomplished a number of things early on, but he placed a ceiling on what Christianity could do that was low. It was too low, unfortunately. It's accomplished a lot, but now it's hitting limitations.
Thank you. Doreen, your turn.
Yeah, it's true. The culture at the time, it was to be expected to give up something in order to get something. So whoever came up with the idea about sin, so you're guilty already, that means you have to atone for something. And the whole preceding history is sacrificing and penitence and suffering. Even the laws that they had, I think I read there was 614 rules in, I think it was the Torah, laws. And it's like, so everything was sort of thinking in terms of negative and punishment and burdens. There was no love, you know, in the way he came about to preach. How is something attractive to people? And in a short period of time, I believe that Jesus was around. I don't know how he expected to turn over a whole culture of Jewish people that was steeped in doctrine and history of everything but love. And they did talk about love in the Psalms, and I remember, but it was mostly reasoning and questioning and giving up and sacrificing. It just, you know, when I came to the Arancha book, it was nothing that would have appealed to me if it wasn't so beautiful in its expression. Otherwise, you would put it down. If you remember, people used to walk in the streets preaching the gospel. Who would pay attention to that? It was hell and damnation and things like that. So sin, atonement, sacrifice, I think that is just part of the history. And to me, I can't see that it would accomplish anything and then you didn't have the spirit of truth. So you understand there was a lot missing for the people to be able to adapt to a new teaching.
Thank you. Charles, I would like you to succeed Doreen, but in doing so, please focus on the second sentence of the short excerpt that Steve read. These efforts failed at winning the Jews, but did not fail to confuse and alienate many honest souls in all subsequent generations. There are two elements there. They failed to win the Jews, but alienate and confused other people. So for many generations that followed. Would you take a look at both of those ideas, please?
Yes, first the second. I think confusion led to alienation. To alienate means to be estranged, a stranger. You feel a stranger to something. Jesus' teachings about the love of God and his exemplification in his life, living God's love, cannot be squared with the notion of sacrifice as it was practiced, including what was done to him. And I think the problem in convincing many Jews had to do with the inherent logic of sacrifice in the general Jewish cultural, at the time, notion of due process, that justice required a strict constructionist approach to law. But people are motivated by their vocabulary and their rituals. Rituals are simply habits repeated. Vocabulary, people's opinions and views and reactions are shaped by the words they use. And the words they use reveal what they actually value. And it's no wonder it didn't work. It never really had a fair shot at working. But it was introduced. And once having been introduced, it could be nurtured for hundreds of years.
Bob?
But,
I'm sorry, Charles, did you?
No, go ahead.
Continue? All right, Bob, your turn.
First sentence or second sentence? Follow up on both of them?
Whatever you wish.
Well, I was just kind of thinking of the second sentence here, Neil. And though these efforts failed as winning the Jews was concerned, they did not fail to confuse and alienate many honest souls. I think they're still talking about, at that time, the Jews, because it certainly didn't alienate any of the pagans, it seems, and it overtook the whole Roman Empire with this idea of the atonement or sacrifice of God's only son. So it certainly, as everybody has said, the prevailing attitude, at the time was sacrifice. I think of the, the old plate that was in the, in the Old Testament, and either Abraham or Isaac who, had to sacrifice his son, and, the angel came in, rounding third base and slid home and stopped him just in time because he passed the test, so to speak. So that's the prevailing attitude, and it's most of what's in the Old Testament. There are parts of the Old Testament where the Father's mercy and love shows up, but God's fatherly heart was austere and cold in those times. And of course, at that time, the Jewish prophecy was for a kingdom Messiah, meaning a land kingdom, meaning a civilization, a social kingdom, not the kind of kingdom that Jesus taught the apostles.
And a military kingdom, actually.
Yes, thank you very much. Makes a little bit more sense there, Marvin. So it's obvious that Paul was attempting to bring his own brethren into this idea of the new spiritual kingdom of the brotherhood. But it's easy to see that with the prevailing attitude, with the idea of the Messiah, to confuse and alienate those individuals at that time was almost a no-brainer. Over.
Steve, you may take any of these strands and do with them as you wish. There are quite a few rich issues that people have raised before you.
Okay. Well, I don't really have a lot of respect for the Midwayers Commission on this subject. Hate to say it. The idea of Jewish sacrifice before Christ took place in the context of the covenant between God and Israel, between Yahweh and Israel. And that was a loving covenant. That expressed God's love for the people of Israel and the love of the people of Israel for God. So it was taking place in a loving context, not in an angry, jealous God context. All of these statements that we're talking about right now really apply more to post-Reformation Christianity than they do to New Testament Christianity. And they apply more to John Calvin and St. Augustine than they do to St. Paul. This is a projection way back 1,500 years from the Reformation back to the New Testament. The idea of ransom, for instance, Jesus spoke of himself being the ransom. Well, early Christians understood Christ to be a ransom from sinfulness, okay, freedom from sinfulness. So whenever you freed a slave, you paid a ransom. So early Christians and St. Paul understood Christ to free them from sinfulness, the life and death of Christ, to free them from sinfulness. And therefore, Christ's life and his death was considered to be a ransom. Later on, 300 years later, St. Anselm turned that into a legal agreement as per the Roman understanding of ransom. The other thing is the idea of sacrifice. A sacrifice for the early Christians and for St. Paul did not have to do with dying to appease an angry God. That is not really in the New Testament. What Christ's death did was to free them from sinfulness. And the idea was moral transformation based on Christ's example. And his example in death was considered a martyrdom. And martyrs in Greek and Roman society were held up as moral examples of how to live and how to die courageously for a cause greater than themselves. And that's how they understood Jesus' life to be. He died for a cause greater than himself, which was to free Jews and Gentiles from sinfulness. That was the main understanding in the New Testament and in Paul's letters.
Thank you, Steve. We've gone the full cycle here, and it is logical to continue with the additional citation that starts at the bottom of the page. I would like to call on Marvin to read that, and pointing out that the quotation extends over to the top of page 92, and I would like you to continue all the way through these three paragraphs, which in this case are by a divine counselor, not by the Midway Commission. Marvin? Marvin, you're muted at the moment.
Is that better?
Yes.
The barbarous idea of appeasing an angry God, of propitiating an offended Lord, of winning the favor of deity through sacrifices and penance, and even by the shedding of blood, represents a religion wholly puerile and primitive, a philosophy unworthy of an enlightened age of science and truth. Such beliefs are utterly repulsive to the celestial beings and the divine rulers who serve and reign in the universes. It is an affront to God to believe, hold, or teach that innocent blood must be shed in order to win his favor or to divert the fictitious divine wrath. The bestowal of a paradise sun on your world was inherent in the situation of closing a planetary age. It was inescapable, and it was not made necessary for the purpose of winning the favor of God. This bestowal also happened to be the final personal act of a creator's son in the long adventure of earning the experiential sovereignty of his universe. What a travesty upon the infinite character of God. This teaching that his fatherly heart in all its austere coldness and hardness was so untouched by the misfortunes and sorrows of his creatures that his tender mercies were not forthcoming until he saw his blameless son bleeding and dying upon the cross of Calvary. But the inhabitants of Urantia are to find deliverance from these ancient errors and pagan superstitions respecting the nature of the universal Father. The revelation of the truth about God is appearing, and the human race is destined to know the universal Father in all that beauty of character and loveliness of attributes so magnificently portrayed by the Creator's Son who sojourned on Urantia as the Son of Man and the Son of God. That's from a Divine Counselor, paper 60, section 3, paragraphs 5 to 6, and also paper 4, section 5. Yeah, well, it's...
Sorry, Marvin, you've gotten mixed up because of the way that I listed. It's page 60, and then it is paper 4, and so on. So that
Got it.
The paper is at the second part of the attribution after the slant mark.
Yeah, but simply to find it, it's paper 60, section 3 that you'll find these paragraphs.
No, it's page 60.
Oh, page 60, got it, sorry.
Yeah. So if we now look at some of the ideas contained in these 3 paragraphs, I would like to start with the premise of an angry father and perhaps, if you allow me the word vindictive, a vindictive judge. Now, the word vindictive does not appear in the excerpt that Marvin read, but it has been part of the psychology of understanding, at least in some segments of Christianity. So we have anger and vindictiveness, the idea of a judge who is punitive. And I put to Bob the comparison with a human judge, at least in a civilized country. I am not aware of any civilized country in which a judge will condemn an innocent person for a crime that someone else committed. Could you please comment on the idea of a judge and perhaps anger and vindictiveness, Bob?
Sure. Wasn't expecting that question, to say the least. It does seem that this particular growth in the early church with this idea of the atonement concept, and either way that we really look at it, either as as a ransom, which Moses started. Moses tried to change if we go to the the section 7 on in paper 89, the modifications of human sacrifice, we're taught that Moses attempted to end human sacrifices by inaugurating the ransom as a substitute for sacrifice, and he established a systematic schedule which took care of vows, land properties and children being redeemed, so on and so forth. So no, I mean, today we don't see a judge that would convict someone for someone else's errors, crimes, for example. So this entire idea of how this atonement operates, which is explained by that last sentence that Marvin read. When I saw that for the first time, I think that it really caught me because this is probably one of the few areas that the revelators teach with almost, I guess you could say, bombs and bullets. It's a very strong statement. It's a travesty upon the infinite character of God, much less just a human judge who's not going to do that. So this teaching, which has survived 2,000 years, is one, as we get a little bit further down the road into the atonement part of it, I think is going to plays a very big role in how human society operates. So I'll leave it at that. Turn it back to the group to kind of talk a little bit more about it. But I've always been very impressed by that last sentence there, where the austere coldness and hardness of the Father, the infinite Father, was so untouched by the misfortunes and sorrows of his creature that his tender mercies were not forthcoming until he saw his blameless Son bleeding and dying upon the cross of Calvary. Even more so than what you even asked in the question, Neil. So,
well, thank you for answering the question that I attempted to ask. Obviously, there are many elements in these paragraphs, and we can't discuss all elements simultaneously. Charles, I would like you to add whatever you wish to the observations that Bob just made, but in particular, comment also on the psychological and emotional character of a father, and whether the idea of a father perhaps influenced the teachings of Paul and subsequent generations, in the sense that fathers were cold and austere and maybe angry, and whether perhaps the idea of fatherhood, of being a father, has improved in those 2,000 years, so that now the contrast seems to us even more intense than it was then. Charles?
Well, before I do, Pontius Pilate condemned an innocent man, a man he knew was innocent. And there are judges that do that, at least in American history. It's happened. In fact, it's happened many times to particularly individuals in certain groups. It's a good thing our souls are not dependent upon human justice, put it that way. The nature of God revealed with such behavior is first and foremost, seems to me to be that God is highly sectarian in his viewpoint, that he selects. One doesn't get the sense that God is no respecter of persons here. That's not what's being projected, it seems to me. Now, all fathers, at least human fathers, have to at some point make assessments or judgments of their children, but judging does not define fatherhood. Love can do that. Love goes furthest in that regard. So God is projected as a judge, very stern, hardly as a father, if at all. And one gets the sense that the universe is law-oriented, guided by a very strict constructionism of that law. I also want to say something because it bothered me when I thought about it again. I think Jesus referred to the Sanhedrin and others who are their allies as hypocrites. And I believe they were. I think they knew better. And yet they condemned him to death. Pilate offered them, as I recall, 2 real criminals, actual criminals. And they refused that. It seems to me that the enemies of Jesus, using Roman authority, or misusing it, through Pontius Pilate, who was a coward, had 2 aims in mind. The first was to kill Jesus, and in their thinking, eliminate the threat. But there was, at least on that level, there was a bigger threat. They didn't want to just kill him. They wanted to have him discredited. And they mistakenly thought that by putting him through Roman due process, etc., ultimately ending on the cross, they could somehow they construed in their twisted thinking they could discredit him, and that was a bigger threat, not to do that from their point of view, because they must have feared him what might happen beyond the grave, to some extent, his influence, his reputation, and they had in mind, I think, a combination of vainglory and bigotry. The cross represents to me the moral equivalent. I'm just getting all this off my chest. The moral equivalent of a state-sanctioned assassination. And unfortunately, Pilate was culpable in that. He could have stopped it if he wanted to, but he didn't. And it's a great tragedy. But human justice is by no means even-handed historically in the last 2,000 years. By no means. It's often biased, whimsical, arbitrary, and by those in power, those in authority. And even though sometimes those in power run amok, like King Charles I had his head cut off. Even the king would sometimes suffer the slings and arrows of human injustice by judges. To what extent the crucifixion, the cross, influenced that experience, and to try to rationalize it with a sacrifice, I do not know. But I know this: people's lexicon reflects their value system, and their actions do as well. There was something in the Jewish culture that encouraged these men to engage in this state-sanctioned assassination, and that they could somehow have it excused. And it's unfortunate. However, it must be said that Jesus asked that the masses at least be forgiven. And I think they should in his generation. But I don't want to judge, at least I be judged myself. But the portrayal of God through the lexicon of the Sanhedrin, or the enemies of Jesus generally, and the mob, or turned into a mob, that lexicon reveals a God that I would not want to get to know. Certainly I can't imagine deriving grace from such a God. The law maybe, but not grace. And no wonder one closing thought, we have a nickname, the world of the cross. That's how traumatic this is. Our label, the world of the cross, has gone out in the universe, at least Nebadon, apparently. Even though the world is a shrine, notwithstanding that label. The cross can be interpreted in many other ways. And Jesus will triumph over the cross as well, the very cross that murdered him. Thank Almighty God.
Charles, thank you for highlighting the psychology that happened among the people who were there at the time. And I can share the general appraisal of their cruelness and vindictiveness and hatred of Jesus, especially as evidenced by the Jewish leaders who brought about his death, and the cowardice of Pontius Pilate, who passed judgment on a person whom he knew to be innocent. Our focus, however, has to do with the spiritual interpretation that the Apostle Paul and others put on this event, whereby they interpreted it as eradicating a spiritual debt to the Father and substituting for the sins of human beings. Marvin, I saw your finger go up, and therefore I will now recognize you.
You touch on it, and Charles touched on it. I think all of us, Bob, you've touched on it already as well. I think there's a fundamental set of questions that are perennial, and it has to do with what's the nature of a human being, what's the nature of God, and what's the nature of our relationship as human beings to God. And there's a fundamental dilemma that all human beings have wrestled with for ages immemorial, and that we wrestle with today because it's inherent in human psychological nature. And that is, what do we do with our brokenness? What do we do with the fact that we're incomplete, fallible, we make mistakes, we screw up, and in the worst cases, we perpetrate horrendous evil? How do we reconcile our being in this state with the perfect state of God, all loving and perfect in his intention, her intention in making the creation? How do we reconcile that discrepancy? And the atonement doctrine, sacrificial methodologies of different kinds, for ages and ages and ages, have been a method sociologically, religiously, for bridging that gap. Basically, what they're saying is, if we atone for our evil, whether it's inherent or we've gained it along the way, we have to bridge that gap somehow. We have to make ourselves clean to come to God. Is what the struggle is. And sacrificial approaches address that issue. And that's why I think Paul, and that's why all the surrounding cultures at the time had sacrificial theologies, and why Paul appended it to what Jesus taught. The problem is that it says something about the nature of God, that God requires this kind of penance in order to accept us and love us, which was grossly inconsistent with what Jesus actually taught. So what does our revelation, this latest revelation, the Ranch book, say in terms of how to remedy that gap between our nature and God's nature? And it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things they say is that there's an order of angels that as the ages proceed, they help our cultures to bridge from what they call the atonement doctrine to, and they use this word, the at-one-ment doctrine. So the way to reconcile it is to realize that God has placed his own presence in the depths of our nature, in the midst of our imperfection. And the other thing is, with this revelation, we have this incredible vista of God being an intimate relationship with us that is of a parent-child nature. And how does a parent or true loving parent relate to the child's incompleteness or frailties or wrongdoing? I mean, a good loving parent loves that child, recognizes its immaturity, and recognizes that the child is made immature. It's created primitive and is evolving or growing, and that with the help of the parent will overcome those incompletenesses, those frailties, the brokenness, and move toward the ideal that the parent has in mind for that child. And the evangelical revelation gives us an eternal time frame. One of the things has struck me is that the goal of perfection that God commands us to reach for makes no sense other than in an eternal time frame. What kind of sense does it make for me to think I need to be perfect like God if I have to do that summarily. I can't do it. It's a recipe for failure. So the only way that I can bridge my broken nature, my incomplete nature, with the perfection that God requests from me is A, with God's intimate support and help, and B, that I have an eternal life in which to slowly grow and mature and perfect in the way God hopes I will. And so that's the real answer. The reason it's so confusing to people is because there's a discrepancy. My sense is there's a profound discrepancy between the kind of God, as you mentioned, Neil, that would, or even a poor judge wouldn't require an innocent party to suffer in order to accept the penance of a guilty party. You know, it makes no sense, even on a human level. So there's a huge discrepancy between the perfect loving God, parental loving God that Jesus puts forward, and this idea that God would need that kind of sacrifice from an innocent party to accept an erring party. It's a huge inconsistency, and it just makes no sense. And I think modern people just say fie upon that. I don't want to deal with it. I just reject it outright because it emotionally, psychologically, it doesn't meet my need, except on a primitive level. And there are plenty of people who still accept it on that primitive level. But thinking, sophisticated and especially scientifically aware human beings just won't accept a God concept that is that puerile, that is that primitive.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Steve now for your further comments. But before I do that, I have a particular focus that I'd like to suggest to you, on the understanding that you are free to go in other directions as is available for all of us as we talk. But my focus that I suggest to you is the contrast, perhaps a stronger word, the contradiction between a loving father in the vein that Marvin has very eloquently described, and the concept of a judge, somewhat vindictive, keeping track of human beings, weighing their sins, and by implication in the atonement doctrine, accepting the suffering of his son by Christian teaching in retribution for the sins of humanity. I'm in effect asking you to predict a way out of this, because obviously human beings need to get to the point of accepting a loving father. Steve?
Well, obviously there's a contradiction there, a huge contradiction. And I really don't think that Christianity would have spread throughout the early European world, the Roman world, with that kind of contradiction. So what I'm saying here is that contradiction was not present in early Christianity. And I totally agree with the divine counselor saying what he said about appeasing an angry God. But that idea of atonement is only one of at least 4 models of atonement, and was not the model of atonement that started out in early Christianity. And that gained strength, particularly, as I said before, with the Reformation. So what he's speaking about is an idea that's taken hold since, Reformation theology has taken hold. So there's no doubt that there is a huge contradiction to the detriment of Christianity, because that idea has taken hold as the atonement model. But there are other models that have always been present in Christianity. And in fact, the word atonement has always meant at-one-ment. That is not a neologism. That is the initial meaning of the word when it was first coined back in the 3rd or 4th century. It was called at-one-ment. And that was the point of it. And, I totally agree this model of substitution, which is what it's called theologically, substituting the life of Christ for the sins of men and women, is totally primitive and very harmful. But there are other models that can be and were understood at the time of Paul and in early Christianity that had nothing to do with appeasing an angry God. That's an anachronism that's projected backwards in the Urantia book. by the Revelatory Commission. It's just not accurate historically.
Doreen, you now have an opportunity to take any of these ideas and run with them in the direction that you wish. I will not ask you to round third base and slide into home plate in the way that Bob ascribed to the performance of an angel, but you may please do whatever running you wish to do, or perhaps calmly seating and speaking while you are seated.
Seated, not seated.
Yes, I understand. Well, I have ceded the microphone to you. How's that?
Yeah, there's so many directions that we spoke of, but the idea from Adam and Eve that it's passed on through the males, this evil, seed, and that everybody from then on, all the generations, have to be punished or condemned for what Adam and Eve did. And how I think about it is that I think if Jesus would have given the history from the times of Adam and Eve and Melchizedek and continued down, even from the planetary prince, to give them that the understanding of where this all came from. You take something cold and you present it to a group of people that are steeped in all kinds of rituals and sacrifices. And I don't think life was so loving and fathers were so wonderful. I think life was harsh. I had read some of, I think the Old Testament, there was, some writings, and it was so sad to read. It brought tears to my eyes. They were suffering, and they were beating themselves up because they did wrong, and sin is everything. And even if you think of thou shalt not, if you talk bad to your parents, I think there was death at one time. So it's a carryover, from such a long time into their religion. And it just doesn't change when somebody comes out and starts preaching all this love and wonderful things without having to give up something. It's not their way. They couldn't identify a divine person in a human person. It didn't make any sense to them. And I guess the apostles as well. So I think maybe in my understanding that if you give enough information so that people could get a sense of where you're taking this and why you're taking it and who God is, and that he is a God of love. But how do you explain all this in such a short period of time that Jesus lived? It's impossible. It's impossible. Just even he was glad to get the apostles, 2 years or whatever he traveled with them, to get them to know who he was. Because you see, no matter what happened, he knew he was going to leave the spirit of truth. And that spirit of truth was going to lead people into finding out eventually, where and what it is that he was talking about. But it takes time and education and, authority figures in any group, whether it's church or synagogues, and any group of people, authority figures want to control you. And how do you control people? By giving them guilt, to making them having to repent, and holding them in abeyance to rules and regulations. And it's not full of love. Life was very harsh, even when I was growing up. There was no parents, fathers work, they try to support their families. So Marvin, you're talking about, a time where, loving fathers, that's a model, but my goodness, this is far from being, accurate even in today's world. It's so materialistic that, they're not only the fathers, but the mothers have to work and also support everyone. So love is secondary. I think that if we ever, and some are today, the younger people, recognizing what is important in your life, how do you attract people to love your brother, love love humanity, love your Father, the Heavenly Father. I can understand where he tried to make the parallel. But if you never had the experience, what does that mean? It's words. You don't fall in love, to me, with words. You don't fall in love with an idea. You have to actualize it and you have to experience it. Otherwise, it's like you could love a stone, you know, talking about, I think they said a heart of stone. Well, a lot of people have hearts of stone. So it has to be expressed. And my last thing that I could say is, and I always talk about personal experience because that's what I know best. And the rest is just learned stuff or reading about it from all different books. But if it wasn't for the lack of the love, if it wasn't for the emptiness that a person is starving, that I was starving, I would have been very satisfied with a parent who would have looked for anything more, even though I didn't have the religion. So therefore, I think there is many ways to find what you need. And that's why I think Jesus knew the Spirit of truth would lead us to it, besides the Holy Spirit and the Father Spirit. But it's inevitable. It'll happen, but I do not see it happen for a very long time. For most people, they truly reject the history of the religions, and it is not appealing.
Thank you. This is an extremely important point, both conceptually and philosophically and also religiously. And so I'm going to depart from my usual practice and give each of you an opportunity to comment further. I would like to point to the very last phrase in the final paragraph that Marvin read and ask for comments. The human race is destined to know the universal Father in all that beauty of character and loveliness of attributes, so magnificently portrayed by the Creator's Son, who sojourned on Urantia as the Son of Man and the Son of God. Now, for this purpose, I would like to build a little bit on Doreen's comments about fathers and the reality of life on our planet in this generation, and certainly those that preceded it. In order to know the Father, the universal Father, as a loving being, is it necessary or simply helpful if human fathers in human society move away from the metaphor, the practice of punishment and severity and judgment? Charles, your turn for that.
Would you repeat your question again?
I'll try. I'm not sure I can get every word right. And my question has to do with the idea of a loving father. And if we, humanity, are going to accept the idea of the loving Father, the universal Father, God, is it necessary or simply helpful that the psychology of human fathers improves to have a higher proportion of lovingness and a lesser proportion of anger, vindictiveness, or punishment?
Yes, it's necessary and it's very helpful. I've taught some 4,000 high school students, about 4.5 decades. I'm not making the term up. It's based on my average teacher load year by year. It's a tremendous handicap for a boy or a girl in later adolescence, roughly between the ages of 14 to 18, not to have the influence of a loving, firm father. I would go so far to say the principal, at least in this country, the principal domestic issue is the depreciation of fatherhood from a sociological, psychological point of view. It's depreciation. It's undervaluing. It's an enormous handicap. I've seen many a mother carry extra burdens in all departments, emotional, intellectual, social, moral, because of the relative absence. In the more severe cases, it tends to make, especially among boys, tends to make them feral. With animals, a feral animal can't be domesticated. And that's largely the case. As shocking as that sounds, I've observed it firsthand many times. As shocking as that sounds, I think it's quite true. I was tired going to funerals. I was tired visiting kids in hospitals because of that kind of feral behavior. That's in the more severe cases. But in any case, more to the point of your question, a father's not just a role model. Father's a parent. That's bigger than a role model. It does involve role modeling, but it's bigger than that. It's more profound than that. It's organically essential, I think, in order to connect time and eternity for a child. If we expect people to perceive affirmative, positive connotations, the idea of fathering, cosmic fathering, divine fathering, and not have the experience of a good father on earth, we're expecting something that's not sensible, just isn't sensible. Now, there are individuals who are boys and girls who are exceptions, spiritually, morally, that can rise above that. I was one. I was able to rise above the absence of a good influence by my father. But civilization cannot continue on such a basis. Society can't continue on such a basis. Society needs a foundation. The family is the foundation. It doesn't represent a foundation, it is the foundation, because that's where nurturing on an intimate, personal basis occurs. That's where child rearing initiates, and to a greater or lesser extent continues. All of this not to say how important mothering is, but that's a different discussion, a different point, and it's not comparable to the problem of the depreciation of the idea of fathering. The very word itself should connote something that's reassuring, reliable, firm, fair-minded, loving. A loving father can impose discipline, but in a wise manner, an intelligent manner. An absentee father makes it much, much tougher, in other words, to grow up for the individual boy or girl, and makes it much, much tougher in the aggregate for the civilization to grow up. We will never advance until that and some other problems are effectively addressed. It's not a coincidence the first 5 papers of the Urantia book on the nature and attributes of the universal father. It's not a coincidence that in the last page, the father idea, it is stated blanketly, the father idea is still the greatest notion of God we will ever know. And this is how important this is. Marvin said something I wrote down, our broken nature, and proportional to the depreciation of fatherhood is a subsequent breaking of natures, breaking of people's personal natures, their composition, their psyche. But Marvin gave a great statement of hope. The broken nature can be made whole in eternity. I just wanted to comment on that, try to fit it into the context. Fathering is indispensable. Affect good fathering. Good fathering, true, beautiful, and good fathering is indispensable to religion, to socialization, to personal growth, and to knowing God. And there are certain givens I've observed in teaching so many high school students. I taught them in 3 states, and this is one of them. There is no alternative. There is no substitute for the father. As heroic, and I don't think this is an exaggeration based on what I observe firsthand, as heroic as many a mother is in raising children without a good fathering mate, there is no alternative. There's no substitute for it. If the father is relatively absent or absent completely, then the substitution can't take place, but the compensation is tested all the more. It's the steeper pitch, as we say in carpentry. The roof is steeper to get up. You need a better ladder to do it. And there's an indispensable causality between the two. I believe it states that in the book, that the word father or fatherhood or fathering, when I say the word, I mean the idea, the reality of the idea, the substance of the idea, must become affirmative if we are to move toward our destiny. I believe it will. Between, Doreen mentioned the spirit of truth. Between the thought adjuster and the spirit of truth, I mean the combined influence, we will be all right. Humanity will be all right. But it's something that we should be conscious of. Our leaders should be conscious of it. Religious, political, economic, moral, athletic, social leaders should be aware of it. It should be in politicians' speeches. I lament that it's so infrequent, that the causality is so infrequently drawn. But I can assure you, based on the 4,000 or so students that I taught, and I think they were at the public school mainly, primarily. Least anybody think I had an easy private school, mostly public school kids. I also taught in the state penitentiary in New York, by the way, for a year and a half. And I also taught dozens of kids whose parents I taught. I've seen a lot firsthand, professionally. It's inescapable. It must be done. It ought to be recognized for what it is. We need civilization. In closing, civilization needs men and women who understand this, who articulate it, who exemplify it in their lives, who understand the key ingredients of raising children successfully. It's very easy to have a child. The most difficult and challenging task on earth is to raise a child well, so that that child, through you, can come to recognize the nature of God, or recognize God through his nature or attributes. Otherwise, you have to wait till the mansion rolls.
Thank you, Charles. I would like to turn to Steve next, and in doing that, perhaps follow his lead in talking a little bit about the way words are put together. We have the word father, which comes from the Germanic side of the English vocabulary, but we also have paternal and paternalistic and patriarchal, all of which come from the Romance or Latin side of the vocabulary in English. And the idea of paternal and patriarchal or paternalistic have a very unfavorable flavor in English. I wonder whether this unfavorable flavor addressed to paternal or fatherliness in the other stream of words is an obstacle to understanding the Heavenly Father as a loving being, because the culture that we live in has a negative view of fatherhood in practice. Steve?
Well, that's a good question. Another root for the PAT is patriotism. And I would like to reinterpret the word patriotism as a stand-in for the word loyalty. Now, the Urantia book does speak about loyalty in very high terms. And I think that that is an entree into understanding paternalism. That's a really bad word, paternalism, or paternity, or patriotism. The concept of loyalty was actually was put forth very strongly by a 20th century American philosopher named Josiah Royce in the early part of the 20th century. And I was reading Josiah Royce when I was reading the Urantia book. This was back in the 70s, in the early 70s in graduate school. And those two points of view really dovetailed very well. So when you have loyalty to your parents, you have loyalty to your family, you have loyalty to your siblings, you have loyalty, I don't think is a word that is denigrated by anybody. I think loyalty is really considered to be a universally positive trait, characteristic. So I would always speak about family and being a parent and being a patriot in terms of loyalty to higher ideals, to the highest ideals. And fatherhood can be seen as loyalty to these highest ideals of love and trust and faith and courage. And all these words are used in the Urantia book. And I think loyalty may be a way to summarize the conglomeration of all of them. And so I would just put that out.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Doreen now, and in doing so, perhaps bring in the changes in Western society, certainly from the perspective of the United States, that have emerged in the last generation or two, having to do with emphasizing the value and roles of women. And these are trends that I commend. But I wonder if the net effect of this has been to depreciate or de-emphasize the roles of fathers. And if you think that this might be true, at least in part, how do we overcome that? How do we convey the idea that a father indeed can be loving and kind? How do we convey that the universal father is indeed loving and kind?
Thank you. It's interesting you said that, and I was thinking if people would love God more than they love themselves, they'll be able to recognize what love is. I was last night with a group of young people in a celebration of Hanukkah, and they had little children, babies, and husbands and wives together. And it was wonderful to see the fathers running after the babies, feeding them, putting them on their shoulder, just adoring them. And it was such a change, from when I was growing up, where fathers had a strict role and mothers didn't. I think mothers have to do a better job raising their sons, that's for sure. Not spoiling them, not indulging them, but teaching them how to respect the other sexes and how to treat them. Now, I do have a wonderful role model, and that's my daughter. She and her husband are extraordinary parents. Their children adore their parents. They come home from college or work at any opportunity. They bring everyone over the house. All the kids love their parents. They're happy parents. It's interesting because I observe. My husband came from also a good father, wonderful dad. And that was a role model for me to see how they interact, how a father and a son care for one another. So being religious, and last night it was a religious group of people, they were extraordinary. And even in their thinking is extraordinary. And I could see they will raise their children because their values are there from their religion. Their values are there because perhaps, and they all came from different countries. Some came from Russia, some came from Venezuela, where they were, was not easy. It was very difficult living there, but they came to the United States, and others came from other places. But the appreciation for living where you can have the opportunity to be and develop who you are without repression, without that governmental force on you, and you have to lie and sneak and cheat. So you could really be yourself and develop your potential for being a good mother and a good father. And when, it's always that adversity that people meet. And people told me their stories. They met at an airport. They were both running away, from repressive regimes. And and everybody was there. The older people also had such a good value system, but they all had religion, and whatever religion you believe in, it doesn't matter, but they were truly honest and sincere The driving force was there to be better, to give their children better, and I don't mean material things. It wasn't about that at all. But what ended up, and I know what you're asking as far as if I'm following you, that women today accusing men of doing things 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it happened to most women, that's for sure. But I do not find emasculating men and accusing them at certain, decades later of indiscretions or they should have done better. It's done already. And to bring it out today, I think it's healthy to talk about it and maybe make the male sex aware that it is not acceptable. And it truly isn't, unless it's, you're both in agreement. So the young kids also have a different ethic. So you talk to the young kids, the teenagers, and their sexuality is everywhere. There's no love in their relationships. They don't have a relationship. It's all about sexuality, and it's all about pleasing the opposite sex. And would you want me? And how am I going to get your attention? The problem is, it is demeaning the whole idea of a relationship. So where do you bring God into this? To me, it's an evolutionary process. It is going to take, I guess, to look at it in a larger scheme of things, to see what's happening today, where we're going, and where we came from. And not to get rid of the values that were good just because you think you're progressive and you want to change the whole world into your image. This does not work. So that's what I mean. The parents today, I hope the young people, and I know many, even in my family, they are wonderful parents and their children are wonderful kids. And you could see love. And to me, I'm so excited just to be an observer and see this is happening. But unfortunately, it's not everywhere. That's just what I see. It isn't, I don't know what goes on. But I hear terrible things and I hear good things. So it's a mix. Life will go on and we will learn from our mistakes and we will change the course. I think this is why we're given what we're given, and the time period and the book. When you talk about this book now, I've heard from other people that their pastors even in the Catholic churches, are sometimes reading some of the passages from the book and not mentioning the Urantia book. But the discussions are leading up to the recognition of the most beautiful things that Jesus wrote. So if you could take it from there and recognize slowly it's getting into society, slowly, because we get feedback from people that have experienced this. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to know that there are areas where the seeds are planted everywhere and things will get better. We just cannot rush it, and you cannot legislate it, and you cannot force it. You have to do the best you can in your own environment for your own families. I know I went on too long, but don't get me started.
I will appreciate what you have said, and now simply thank you for these comments and go on to Bob. I'd like, if we could, perhaps go back at least to the theological track that was at the beginning of this discussion, the conviction that there is a punitive side of God, an angry side, a vindictive side, and then ask you to compare the two tracks whereby the ideas of human fathers are evolving, and whether or not the idea of a divine father is evolving in parallel to the idea of the human father, or whether it's different. This is for Bob, and Marvin, I will certainly call on you after Bob finishes.
Neil, last week I sort of accused you of mind reading. Starting to think that might be the case. That's kind of what I wanted to do, because I've had the opportunity now to actually go first in this theme of this first question, and it's gone from we started with atonement, obviously, and sacrifice, and we went to fatherhood. And I want to start with that. Charles brought up and was waxed so eloquently that I can't pass up speaking about that again. To loyalty, which I think is, as Steve brought up, is a very important factor. And kind of wrap that up into my head here a little bit and tell you what I was thinking. So go back to the father concept. And Charles brought up that was in the idea of the father idea was in the last paper. Well, it's in the last sentence of 2,096 pages, and it says, "When all is said and done, the father idea is still the highest human concept of God." If that's the case, then we on Urantia really need the right father concept to be able to do everything that Charles said that we need to do. And Doreen gave some great examples about how she sees that in her family and friends. And I'm certain that if we look around, we can see the same things. But that was a wonderful exposition there, Doreen. So if the father concept is as important and it's the highest human concept of God, the fifth epical revelation, I think that the goal of the fifth epical revelation, I've said this before on one of the Cosmic Citizen shows, is to reveal the reality of the personality of God. There's a whole paper on the nature of God, which is almost pure revelation in my mind, because it's not, I've never thought of it that way. When the divine counselor says, does the Father suffer? Being that he's a part of all humans that have thought adjusters and shares their experience. Does the Father suffer? Even the divine counselor doesn't know. So that's a really interesting answer, to be honest with you about that. So let me go back to the atonement concept, because that's where we started. So if this fatherhood idea is as important as we all believe it is, then the rationale for the religious doctrine of atonement has a direct influence in the human world, in the secular world, and it affects everything that we do. I said I was impressed with that last paragraph, or last sentence, I'm sorry, Marvin read in paper 5. And, his fatherly heart was so untouched by the misfortunes of his creature children. That's not a father that any of us have spoken about. And that's not a judge of anyone that we have spoken about. On a neighboring planet, they talk about the torchbearers. And a father carries that through the family. I can't speak any better than Charles did about the need for fatherhood. I completely agree with you, Charles, 100%. So if the atonement concept is as important to society as religion is supposed to deliver these ideals to us, then the atonement concept is an important concept to crowd out somehow, because it's having a negative effect on our society. The last point I want to make is preparing for this section, I reread paper 89, Sin, Sacrifice, and Atonement. And there was a really interesting sentence in there that I'm still thinking about. And it's section 9 about sacrifices and sacraments, because sacrifices wound up being sacraments in Christianity. And it talks about Paul, and it says his theologic compromises, the atonement for sure, indicate that even revelation must submit to the graduated control of evolution. He was, we started out a couple of weeks ago, and I think you asked me, it sounded like I was almost in sympathy to the apostles, and certainly Paul, because he had to make concessions, and he had to be able to figure out how he was going to deliver this dynamic, difficult message in first century humanity. Even revelation must submit to the graduated control of evolution. Sacrifice was preeminently dominant, and in fact, we know that the sacrifice has been dominant in all primitive societies, planet-wide, partly because of the rebellion, and also partly because of the default of Adam and Eve, where we couldn't be trained very well with this. So here's the last sentence in that paragraph that I'm talking about in paper 89. According to Paul, Christ became the last and all-sufficient human sacrifice. The divine judge is now fully and forever satisfied. Paul had to submit to evolution. He could not present the Father image that Jesus was presenting to the apostles, in my mind, of course. And okay, so now the divine judge is fully satisfied, but we still have the divine judge. And if, in fact, as we've all been talking about, that this fatherhood concept is the most important concept that we can have of God, it's a bidirectional feed. Understanding the nature of God as a father is important for us to be able to mimic that as we have our relationship with God in our religious aspects and our spiritual aspect. So I hope that puts a circle around what we were doing here, circumscribes it a little bit, and I'll toss it back to Marvin.
Well, I would like to interject, Bob. If I was reading your mind, at least I didn't pick up any observations about grandfatherhood.
Good ones. That's a wonderful topic too, Neil. At some point I need to talk about that.
All right. Well, this is not the moment. Marvin, it's your turn now for comments in which I hope you will speak about the theological implications of fatherhood and atonement and so on.
There's a theme that I think has been running through our conversation. I think, Bob, you recapped it well, elements of it. And that is my sense is the interaction between evolutionary factors and revelatory factors in regard to the nature of God, our concepts of God, how our interaction with God affects and impacts us, which is a revelatory impact, and how the culture affects our views of God, our definitions, our constructs about God. So I want to make some comments about the interaction of those two factors, the evolutionary and the revelatory factors. I think they're mutually influential as regards the current state of family situations and in many areas deteriorated state of family relationships and the family as an institution. I think that has an effect on how people view God's parental nature. It affects them negatively, makes it hard for them to trust God in a parental sense. So there's an impact from the evolutionary culture onto the individual. There's also the impact of revelation, and I think of that in two senses. One is epical revelation, meaning the central teachings of Jesus, although those are apprehended evolutionarily through evolutionary institutions, mostly. But the other impact of revelation is in our interior lives. We have connection and communion with God's presence, and the book refers to that as personal revelation versus epical revelation. Now, and the other thing that I'd say is, I think we all tend to come from, to some extent, from our experiential and professional backgrounds and how we look at these things. Charles has alluded to his teaching background a lot. What I tend to bring is my background as a therapist and working with people directly on some of these issues. And what I've seen is there's a question of the direction of causality. You've got an interrelation between these evolutionary and revelatory factors. But what's potent when the two come into interaction? Where does the direction of causality lie? What affects what primarily? And my experience is that revelation is really prepotent. It's potent to affect the residues in the history of evolutionary experience. So what do I mean by that experientially? As someone comes into my office, and which would happen many times, with a lot of family of origin issues and pain, right? Their direct experience with the evolutionary culture in which we all grow up was dysfunctional, screwed them up, and screwed up their senses of the nature of God and their sense of how people relate to each other. And they're in pain and damaged. And my experience is that if I could help them, among other things, move into an experience of direct encounter with God's presence inside, in other words, a revelatory stimulus begin to happen for them of being loved and being nurtured, that could remedy the deficits of the evolutionary context within which they grew up. In fact, it was very powerful to remedy those evolutionary dysfunctional elements. So I think the direction of causality lies from revelation to evolutionary reality. I think if you don't have powerful revelatory function going on, then evolutionary influences tend to hold forth. So I think that's an important, for me, that was a very important realization. And I think it's true both for epical revelation and personal revelation. In other words, I think we've all experienced that our exposure to this epical revelation has in a primary way influenced our lives and remedied the dysfunctional understandings we got from the culture, both in terms of family experience and in terms of philosophical context in the culture. So revelation has impacted us for the better. I think the same is true for personal revelation as well in communion. And then the last thing I'll end with is this quote, which I think is very relevant to what we've been talking about. This is paper 103, section 4, paragraph 4. Jesus swept away all of the ceremonials of sacrifice and atonement. And what I'll say about this is he attempted to do this. The culture overrode him in Christianity. And Christianity, unfortunately, sustained the residue of the evolutionary impacts and overrode this attempt on Jesus' part. And the attempt is still there in this revelation. And the responsibility is ours to move in the direction that they describe Jesus moving in this paragraph. And I'll just share it. Jesus swept away all of the ceremonials of sacrifice and atonement. He destroyed the basis of all this fictitious guilt and sense of isolation in the universe by declaring that men and women are the children of God. The creature-creator relationship was placed on a child-parent basis. God becomes a loving father to his mortal sons and daughters. All ceremonials, not a legitimate part of such an intimate family relationship, are forever abrogated. Notice their use of present tense here. I think that's very intentional. I think they're making a point not only that Jesus attempted to do this, but this is our task as well. That the parent-child paradigm, the underlying archetype of that spiritual reality, is what must guide us in reforming our evolutionary culture in keeping with Jesus' intention. And we have to go about remedying and undoing the errors of the evolutionary trajectory of Christianity in going awry early on in the trajectory of its evolutionary history. So I think that challenge awaits us. And I think this conversation is a small part of that very large endeavor.
Thank you, Marvin, for concluding our discussion on this extremely important topic in a vein that is very uplifting, and I would say inspirational. At least it has been for me, and I appreciate your efforts to move us in that direction. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to stop in the text immediately before question 61 for a series of thoughts that occurred to me as I was preparing for this discussion. Each week, of course, I prepare, you prepare. In thinking about this and the implications of the idea of atonement, it seemed to me that we cannot treat this simply as an abstraction or as a philosophic matter, because the concept of judgment built into atonement, built into the idea of an angry or vindictive God, crept into Christianity in terms of the eternal future of the individual believer. And there were various formulas of teachings that made believers very worried about their personal status before God. We start with, of course, the idea that there is a hell out there, and that if you are not careful, you will end up there and be punished for eternity. So Christianity, in many strands, emphasized the idea of avoiding hell, perhaps as strongly as attaining heaven. And I would hesitate to say which of these psychological anticipations was stronger. It probably differed from one believer to another. But in order to appreciate the consequences of a judgmental father and a very strict and rigorous attitude toward the future of individual human beings, I prepared a list of statements about salvation, which we understand as survival into the afterlife, that have often been associated with traditional Christianity. And unfortunately, the list is not very helpful. In fairness, I have to emphasize that the list consists of examples, that there is no denomination in Christianity that espouses or promotes that espouses and promotes all of these statements. They have come up at various times in history during the last 2,000 years. Many of them have a very specific context. Others are rather general. And so in getting your evaluation of these 10 statements, I will now offer you an opportunity to rate or grade each one. Rating A is true. Rating B is mainly true, but partly false. Rating C, mainly false, but partly true. And rating D is false. And then I give a category of ratings in the case that some statement is difficult to interpret, and I call that X, cannot be evaluated. So I have to stress that these are example statements, and even though they correlate with the spirit of Christian teachings at various times, it is not fair to accuse a particular denomination of making these statements. These are examples that I developed myself in order to exemplify the situation. Because our viewers do not have these statements in front of them as you do, since I sent them to you a few days ago, I will read each of them individually and very slowly. Statement number 1 is as follows: God saves whom he wills. Although it is possible to be optimistic about someone who led a godly life, in the final analysis, we do not and cannot know whether God has chosen a particular person for heaven or for hell. Now, I'm going to read that again. God saves whom he wills. Although it is possible to be optimistic about someone who leads a godly life, in the final analysis, we do not and cannot know whether God has chosen a particular person for heaven or for hell. Charles, how would you rate that statement?
I can't be evaluated. I went through a number of hypotheses. In the end, I concluded God, we search for God and we find him not, particularly in terms of his purpose. Purpose is infinite. He occupies a circle of infinity. It's too much.
I would say, thank you. I would say that by virtue of my role as the moderator, I would associate this statement number 1 with the Reformed strand of Protestant Christianity, and specifically with the idea of predestination. Predestination as a teaching owes much to the theology of Augustine of Hippo, but it became very prominent during the Reformation in the teachings of John Calvin and others who taught that God made a choice about human beings And in some cases, they emphasize that this choice was made even before the child was born. Would you like to rate this statement number one, Marvin?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to read it to me again because I don't have it printed out in front of me.
Okay, it is a statement that has overtones of the doctrine of predestination, as I said. It reads as follows: God saves whom he wills. Although it is possible to be optimistic about someone who leads a godly life, in the final analysis, we do not and cannot know whether God has chosen a particular person for heaven or for hell.
Well, I'll just comment on it. I disagree on pretty much entirely with the statement, in the sense that my understanding is it has, whether our destiny, and of course there is no hell in the context of the Urantia book, so we can eliminate that as a possibility entirely. So it's kind of a non sequitur in terms of our theology. But the question of survival or salvation really doesn't depend on God's predetermination. It depends on our volition, our choice, our will, and the degree to which we aspire to sense God's leading, God's will, and to try to follow it. And my sense is, from reading of the Urantia revelation, is that if I have even the faintest desire to sense what God wants for me and to try to follow it, I'm in. I'm moving through the threshold into the eternal life. And that's because of my choice. And that's what God has established. And whether God foreknows that or not is not particularly relevant for me. What's relevant for me is what's the choice that I make.
Thank you, Marvin. I would venture to sum up your remarks as response D, namely false, that you reject the premises of the question. I think it's fair to conclude from what you've said that that is where the question falls in your estimation.
It works for me.
Okay, thank you. Doreen?
Same question?
Same question. How do you react to it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we know, we're told that there are people who are chosen for certain roles in life, but God is creator. He loves all his children the same. He understands. He doesn't sit in judgment in a material way, how primitive we are. He created us. Why wouldn't he want us to all succeed? So I think it's also false, because it all depends on our decisions and our faith and how we live our life. To me, that is what opens up, the relationship with our thought adjuster to bring us forward. And the thought adjusters don't like to fail, and that's for sure. So definitely, I think it's false.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. I think it's better to ask three people in each case and then go on to the next question. So I will go to statement number 2, which is shorter and simpler. It reads as follows: it is necessary to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, in order to survive into the afterlife. I read it again. It is necessary to believe in Jesus in order to be saved. Steve, how do you rate that statement?
Well, I think that statement depends on how you understand the word belief. Belief can be thought of as faith, and faith can be thought of as faithfulness or loyalty to the teachings of Jesus. So if you talk about belief as a purely cognitive activity, like I believe he crossed the street yesterday, that's a very superficial way of thinking about belief. If you think about belief in terms of faith as faithfulness to the teachings of Jesus, in terms of your actual behavior towards other people and towards God, then belief is a lot more than just cognitive belief. So I disagree with the statement if belief is understood as a cognitive activity. I disagree with that. But if belief is called faithfulness in life to the teachings of Jesus, I would agree with that statement. So both.
How do you want me to record that? Is that X cannot be evaluated because it depends upon the meaning of the word belief?
Sure, yeah, X or Y or Z. I don't
Okay, well, using my random series of possibilities here, we have A, B, C, D, and X, and I think your answer, meaning that this cannot be evaluated because your reactions to it depend on how the word belief is understood. And so that's what I would say. Bob, your reactions to this statement: it is necessary to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, in order to survive into the afterlife.
D. The way that I approach life now is process. And I'm not Alfred North Whitehead thinking about process theology or process philosophy or Charles Hartshorne. But one thing that the Revelation has done for me is it's provided me this look into the process of not only the grand educational scheme, but what the Father does or doesn't do. And since the Father delegates very little, he delegates the thought adjusters and personality and upholds the universe. In order to survive the afterlife, I know in process-wise, I have to have a soul. And if the metaphor that the archangel writes about, that the thought adjuster and my decisions are weaving my soul, then if I have one thread, if I've done something that's been loyal, or one of those, or if I've dived, if I dove into one of the inevitabilities and succeeded there, I'm going to survive in the afterlife. It has nothing to do with belief, I think, or anything else.
So I read that as a rating of false. Is that correct?
D, false.
Charles, your turn. Responding to the statement, it is necessary to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, in order to survive into the afterlife.
Well, I have the same quandary that Stephen does. On the other hand, I'm as written. It's too simplified, too simplistic rather, to evaluate. So X.
Okay. The next statement.
Can I
yes,
actually,
Marvin. All right.
if you don't mind, I think survival depends on a functional set of acts. Whether they unconsciously understand that they're doing that or not, whether they're paying attention to the leading of the indwelling spirit, the thought adjuster. And they can do that unconsciously. They may not understand that that's what's going on, but their function of will is to choose to follow that subtle leading of what is good and true and beautiful in their lives. Their theology can vary all over the place. So you can have atheists, humanists, Buddhists, Muslims, etc., who don't, quote, believe in Jesus, but are following that inner voice in some fashion. That's the arbitration point for survival. So I guess I would be D.
All right. Thank you. The third statement reads as follows: everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved, will survive into the afterlife. And once again, to reiterate the explanation that I gave at the beginning, these are statements that I associate with traditional Christianity over its 2,000 years. They are not quotations from anyone, but I believe that at least some Christians have espoused one or more of these statements. The statement again: everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved, will survive into the afterlife.
Neil, I think we could save time. This is basically a reiteration, it seems like, of the statement just before.
No, the difference is that everyone is here in the third statement. Everyone who believes in Jesus, whereas The previous statement was it is necessary. So now we're going to the point of predicting about everyone who has this belief. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with it again. Again, depending on how you define believe, basically accepting Jesus as Lord or some superficial understanding, which is how I'm taking your statements, what you mean by believe.
Well, I think your previous comments about the necessity of choice, the necessity of actions, the necessity of active pursuit of moral values, in effect, caused this to be false because the word everyone doesn't make those qualifications. And that's probably the key point of this statement. If I see you nodding.
Well, yes and no. I mean, for instance, I can think of an historical example where people who mouthed belief in Jesus perpetrated heinous crimes for that, in the name of Jesus, burning people at the stake and destroying families and spreading hate in the name of Jesus. So, and that's a form of belief. So I say, no, not everyone who accept Jesus for that reason as well would survive. I can't look into their heart and see their motivation, regardless of the labels they place on their motivation. That's God's role.
Thank you. I certainly agree with the construction that you've just given. Another very cogent example is that the migration of Europeans in the 11th century, so-called the First Crusade, actually began with a whole bunch of them traveling through Europe and conducting pogroms against Jews. And they demonstrated that they were good Christians by killing or injuring Jewish people. That doesn't seem like a very good demonstration to me. And I see you're nodding too. Doreen?
Neil?
Yes, Charles?
Well, it seems to me the basic problem here is that none of us are in a position to assess being saved. We simply, it's not given to us. And it has to all remain completely hypothetical. But I'm not sure how much meaning it really has here, or can have.
Charles, your reservations are very well taken, and I share them. The problem in this list of statements is that people in the past 2,000 years have not been as discerning as you just showed yourself to be, nor as discerning as Marvin showed himself to be in his preceding answer. That the touchstone of belief in Jesus was treated as a necessity and then treated as an automatic ticket into heaven and an avoidance of hell. And so, in effect, what I'm portraying is a very simplified doctrine, a very simplified statement about human destiny based on this question of belief. And Steve pointed out that there is an ambiguity in the word belief, and I agree with that. But the ambiguity in the word belief was not an ambiguity that the people who said this had in mind. For them, it was simple. And so, in effect, what I am doing in this series of statements is pointing out that we who have the teachings of the Urantia book have a much better source of content, a much better source of inspiration, and likewise a better source of understanding than many ostensibly believing Christians had in the 2,000 years when some of them made statements like this. So, Charles, do you want to make a comment now, or shall I simply go on to the next person? Steve is attracting my attention on the screen. Charles, I give you a chance to reflect while Steve contributes his thoughts.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Charles.
Okay.
Marvin was making fun of me privately.
I sent him a little chat that said, Neil, you paid him an inadvertent compliment by calling him Jesus. So
I didn't mean to. It was a slip of the tongue.
Sure was.
You're saying if I believe in Stephen, that assures my salvation.
Well, Charles, to you
Well,
then, everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved, will survive into the afterlife.
the statement in the book that if there's the slightest doubt, the mortal goes ahead, would naturally appeal to us because it's a species of mercy. And mercy, from our point of view, our creature point of view as agondantes, is something very attractive to us for obvious reasons. But aside from that kind of, that's an assertion that I can stand with, I can identify with, because it's merciful. And I'll risk the allegation of bias, theological bias in that regard. But they also make it the authors make it very clear that only the Ancients of Days, divine judges, rule on soul survival, whether it's here or in the mansion world. There is a ruling, and they're qualified to do that. Beyond that, I'm not prepared to go.
Well, then I read your answer as false, that you don't agree with this statement.
Okay. Do you say hope?
I hope what? I hope that I've understood you correctly.
I'm not sure I understood the word. I have confidence in those kinds of, those generalizations. As a cosmic citizen, as a child of God, and toward my brothers and sisters, my fellow mortals, I have confidence in as far as those statements go, but no further. And with regard to survival, it is my hope that everyone would survive. I'm sure Universal Father would want everyone to survive. That's what a father would want. All true fathers want all their children to live.
Thank you, Steve. I will now recognize you, and I will certainly refrain from calling you Jesus.
Thank you very much. So, I'm just trying to think, even the most superficial Christian way back whenever, if you asked him or her if they meant by belief just the mouthing of certain words, whether that will account for their salvation, I just really wonder whether, the mouthing of words or a hypocritical belief. I think what you're not differentiating between is hypocritical belief and true belief in the terms of an existential stance. So if you interpret belief as an existential stance in reality, where you put your mind, body, and soul, to this belief, into this belief, that's one kind of belief. But if you would ask somebody, well, does somebody get to heaven if all they're doing is mouthing a certain group of words? I don't think the most superficial understanding of Christianity would agree with that. I mean, the statement "faith alone," from Luther, faith alone did not mean just superficial belief. It meant a lot more than that. So that's what I'd have to say, I guess.
I think you have been remarkably consistent. You continue to make your valid point about what the word belief means and the implications of it. And so I shall simply take the initiative as the moderator to mark you once again as X cannot be evaluated in regard to this statement. Now, ladies and gentlemen, actually there's only one lady here. Lady and gentlemen, slight variation on the usual statement. We have not quite gone to 2 hours in terms of duration because the program started at about 12 minutes past the hour in the first place. But I'm conscious that a couple of our panelists today have other obligations, and therefore I will stop here and we can resume with statement number 4 as the first item of business for our program next week on December 15th. So I appreciate very much your contributions. They have been very interesting throughout the entire broadcast and partly truly inspiring at certain moments at least. So thank you, lady and gentlemen. and I'll see most of you next week.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil.
Bye, everybody.
Wish everybody well.
See you.
Adios.